Hey everybody, just wanted to do a quick lecture on extending science to policy and everyday life. So we're going to start and oh, my son is upset. I think he's going to settle. All right, so extending science to policy in everyday life and sort of trying to take the scientific method maybe a step further and talk about how the process of science can be used to inform policy and also how you can sort of use this idea to think about everyday life. So the scientific method is sort of presented on the right of the screen, and it's the same old you're pretty familiar with, I'm sure. You make an observation, you ask some question, you construct a hypothesis, test those hypotheses, and then you analyze your data and draw conclusions, and then you ask more, make more observations and ask more questions. So it's an never-ending cycle ongoing. And as part of that, you have to communicate your work, of course, as scientists. And this is just to give credit to the folks that published this, the research articles on your left there. So what I'm going to talk about next is really from this book called The Honest Broker, and it's by Roger Pielke, and it's a really interesting book to talk about how science can be thought of in different ways and used in different manners by policymakers. So there's sort of these four idealized roles of science, and the first is a pure scientist. And this is the person who provides only the facts. And I sort of think of this a bit like the introduction to a scientific paper, where there's just facts presented about past information, past work, and that type of thing. And then there's the science arbiter, and the science arbiter basically provides stakeholders with answers to their questions. So the stakeholder asks an appropriate question, and the science arbiter will provide a factual answer to that question. Then there's the issue advocate, and this person attempts to convince or sway stakeholders towards a specific answer. And this often, in this process, they're often trying to limit the stakeholder scope of the problem. And you can think about probably a lot of, this is one of the problems I think that scientists get into sometimes, acting as issue advocates, and when there are maybe other sides to the issue that can be argued, and so people start to question science and the scientists themselves. And then lastly, there's the honest broker, and the honest broker provides facts as well as information on choices that you can make, and it allows an expanded set of options. It provides the stakeholders with information and tools to make decisions based on their set of values and preferences. And really, I think of this sort of like the results and discussion or conclusion sections of a scientific paper. So now I want to sort of give some examples. And so suppose that I showed up in your hometown or the town where you're living now and asked you, where's a good restaurant? And as a pure scientist, you would just provide me with a copy of the USDA food pyramid and let me make the decision based on that. And of course, the USDA food pyramid is supposed to provide us with what is considered a balanced diet. And then there's the science arbiter, and this person would provide me with factual answers to questions that I ask. So for example, I might ask, how far to the nearest pizza place? Or how many pizza places are there within 5 miles of me, etc. And then the issue advocate would try to convince me to eat at a particular restaurant. You can probably imagine a lot of different reasons that an issue advocate might want to convince me to eat at a certain restaurant. Maybe it's your brother's restaurant, or maybe you really like the owner, or maybe you do like the food, or maybe there's only 2 restaurants in the town and you don't like the other person who owns the restaurant. Who knows? There are a lot of reasons. And then lastly is the honest broker, and this person would provide me with a list of all the restaurants in the city. Then they would give me some basic information that is factual, like the cost, the distance to the restaurant from where I'm staying, things of that nature. And this really would allow me to make a decision based on my preferences. And so these 4 models can be sort of put into this view of science versus the view of democracy, and I'm not going to get into these these things, but I want to sort of point out that the linear model with the pure scientist and science arbiter act as information resources, while the stakeholder model really acts as to explicitly engage decision alternatives. And then the next thing I want to take a look at is the same figure, but here you have to consider, where did the scientist's facts come from? So for example, the USDA food pyramid has quite a lot of politics that goes into it, as well as large corporations influencing the pyramid and things of that nature. So there's that component. Then you can also consider that there are other food pyramids that would be preferred by certain people. So there may be vegan pyramids or Atkins pyramids, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly is this idea that you need to be aware of these stealth issue advocacy. And this would be a scientist who claims to be only interested in the science when in fact they're trying to push for some alternatives, so trying to restrict the options that stakeholders have. Now, as an example of all of these, I want you to think about this idea of climate change. And with climate change, we can have two alternatives. So you can think about climate change is not happening or climate change is happening. And then we can think about we cannot act or we can act. And so if climate change is not happening and we do not act, then hey, we made a good decision, right? But what happens if climate change is happening and we do not act? Well, we made a pretty bad decision. Alternatively, we can say climate change is not happening and we act. Well, we made a bad decision. And then we could think about climate change is happening and we acted. And so again, yay, we made a good decision. Now, that's pretty simple, right? You can think about this, all of the difficulties and intricacies and nuances about this. And you can think about what does it mean to act? What uncertainties do we have about climate change in terms of what is going to be impacted, where, when, things of that nature. So it's a really complex and complicated issue, and these are some of the things that scientists deal with, and I would propose that the honest broker is the best approach, because you allow for an array of alternatives that can be addressed by policy, as opposed to what happens with a lot of times with science, where there are no answers provided by science, just sort of the facts, and there are sort of a discussion of what can happen if we don't act or if we continue along this path, as opposed to providing some alternatives and solutions. So that's that, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.